One of the defining characteristics of German tank construction during World War II was a pronounced tendency to reinforce both armor protection and weaponry. Such a significant increase in armor without a radical redesign of the chassis, as seen with the Germans, was unparalleled among other tank-building nations worldwide. For instance, in the case of the Panzer III, the frontal hull armor protection increased by more than 3 times compared to the original tank. The Panzer IV became the record holder. Its frontal hull armor protection grew by 5.5 times compared to the original Begleitwagen design. Furthermore, the Germans were known for their dedication to improving the protection of tanks already in service. This discussion will cover the methods used for these additional reinforcements. Such a substantial increase in the armor protection of German tanks often leads to certain public perceptions, some of which are misconceptions. The fact is that the growth in armor protection indicates not only the chassis' capacity for reinforcement, which will be discussed later, but also the inadequacy of tank armor protection against the anti-tank weapons of the time. The design of the Zugführerwagen, which would become the Panzer III, and the Begleitwagen, which would become the Panzer IV, began in 1934. At that time, tanks generally featured protection against bullets. In the German context, this meant armor approximately 0.57 inches thick. Light German tanks, such as the LAS or Panzer I and the LAS 100 or Panzer II, had the same armor. The approach to this issue was largely similar in other countries during that period. By September 1939, the Panzer II, one of the main tanks of the German army, had armor that offered protection primarily against rifle-caliber bullets. Even Polish anti-tank rifles found such protection to be insufficient. The situation changed in late 1936 when the first German tanks encountered the T-26 in Spain. The Panzer I, a tank armed purely with machine guns, proved to be a poor design because its armor-piercing bullets could only penetrate the T-26 at nearly point-blank range. Meanwhile, the Soviet light tank, armed with a 1 77/100-inch cannon, could engage the German vehicle at line-of-sight distance. Nevertheless, most countries did not entirely grasp the initial lessons of the Spanish Civil War. The primary adversaries for tanks turned out to be not anti-tank cannons of 1 46/100 inches to 1 77/100 inches caliber, but rather heavy machine guns and light automatic cannons. Such systems could penetrate armor 0.79 inches to 0.98 inches thick. Consequently, many tank-building nations raised the standard for armor protection precisely to counter light automatic cannons. For this reason, the armor protection of the Soviet A-20 and A-32 tanks was 0.98 inches. The protection of American light tanks initially increased to 0.87 inches, and then to 0.98 inches. In the case of British cruiser tanks, armor protection was boosted to 1 1/10 inches. The Germans, for their part, raised the standard to 1 18/100 inches. A severe deficiency in armor protection also became apparent in medium tanks. The Polish Army's possession of 1 46/100-inch anti-tank cannons proved to be a very unwelcome development for the Germans. However, this was not the case for all German tanks. Panzer II tanks continued to be produced with the old armor thickness, and no one attempted to add spaced armor to the Panzer I. The reason was clear: not everyone understands what a tank truly is. It is not just a tracked vehicle that is clad with thicker armor and fitted with a larger gun. A tank is a combat machine designed to the limits of what is possible. It must meet specific tactical and technical requirements, including its weight, specific power, speed, armor protection, operational range, armament, ammunition capacity, and crew. Designers must integrate all these factors into the combat vehicle, often requiring compromises. The result is a tank that, while having some capacity for modernization, should not be expected to have unlimited upgrade potential. The capacity for modernization is not infinite, especially when there are issues with certain parameters. These problems worsen when some parameters cannot meet the requirements. For example, the initial requirements for the Panzer I specified a combat weight of 6,614 pounds, but in reality, it turned out to be 11,905 pounds. Because of this, the chassis had to be redesigned and the power plant had to be changed, resulting in the Panzer I Model B with a combat weight of 12,787 pounds. There was simply no reserve left for increasing armor protection. In the case of the Panzer II, the initial specification called for a combat weight of 13,228 pounds, but it first came out at 16,755 pounds, and for the main production series, it reached 19,622 pounds. Understanding the direction things were heading, the MAN company reworked the running gear and installed a more powerful engine. However, initially there was no discussion of increasing armor protection. The first German tanks to receive spaced armor appeared in France in May 1940. These were the Panzer II. For medium tanks, the situation was somewhat simpler. Initially, the Panzer III project was in such a difficult state that much of the tank had to be redeveloped. Therefore, for the Panzer III, armor protection of 1.18 inches was planned from the outset. In the case of the Panzer IV, the increase in combat weight was initially only 1,102 pounds. Furthermore, the Panzer IV Model B was fitted with a more powerful Maybach HL 120 TRM engine, which even increased its specific power. The Panzer IV also turned out to be the only German tank that met its original weight requirements. However, it was smooth only on paper. The Red Army realized the flaw in the idea of tanks protected only against light automatic cannons in the summer of 1939 during the battles near the Kalkengol River. For the Germans, a wake-up call sounded on September 1, 1939. On the very first day, the Germans encountered Polish anti-tank guns for which armor 1.18 inches thick was not a problem. The side armor of the Panzer IV also proved insufficient. One of the victims of Sergeant Orlik, the first tank ace of World War II, was precisely such a tank, penetrated by a 0.79-inch automatic cannon. It was after the September 1939 campaign that the Germans began to consider adding spaced armor to their existing tanks. German medium tanks did not receive spaced armor in time for the French campaign. However, in France, the first instances of using spare tracks as additional armor were noted. Additional armor for the Panzer II was prepared in the autumn of 1939. Additional plates, 15 to 20 millimeters thick, covered the front of the superstructure and the front part of the turret, and were attached with bolts. In addition, the hull front received additional spaced armor, 20 millimeters thick, which was also attached with bolts. The kits began to arrive in the troops in February 1940, but deliveries were slow. Therefore, not all tanks received additional armor protection by the time of the French campaign. However, this protection was primarily against small-caliber automatic cannons and outdated anti-tank guns. For British 2-pounder, 40mm cannons, not to mention French 47mm tank and anti-tank guns, such armor did not provide protection. There was no further possibility to reinforce the armor. The screens had already increased the combat weight of the tanks to 20,943.9 pounds. Furthermore, it is important to understand that spaced armor and a solid plate were not the same thing. Among the pre-war medium tanks, only the Panzer IV received additional armor. A small chassis load limit meant that only the hull's front plate was reinforced. The situation with medium tanks developed differently. Panzer III models A through D were not even considered for additional armor, as these vehicles appeared outdated and their production volume was negligible. As for the Panzer IV and Panzer III models, E through F, they were not initially considered for additional armor. Only in the spring of 1940 did work begin to strengthen the armor protection of Panzer IV models D through E or R. The first set of screens was ready at Krupp by May 15, 1940. A front screen, 20 millimeters thick, was attached flush against the hull's front plate. Another screen of the same thickness covered the central section of the hull's side in the combat compartment area. Subsequently, screens 30 millimeters thick, attached with bolts, appeared on the front part of the superstructure, while screens 20 millimeters thick were attached to its sides. The turret remained without screens, and the combat weight increased to 44,092.4 pounds. Deliveries of these screens began only on June 25th, which was after the end of the fighting in France. Theoretically, this reinforcement was intended to make the hull front impervious to shells of 25 to 40 millimeters. The spaced armor installed on the tanks more closely matched the experience of the September 1939 campaign. However, the French already possessed a number of SA Model 1937 anti-tank guns, for which such armor protection did not pose a significant challenge. Additionally, medium and combat tanks were equipped with 47mm guns, slightly weaker than the anti-tank versions, but even for these, the screens were not particularly problematic. Moreover, the Germans themselves understood that a screen was not the same as solid armor, and the turret's armor protection had not increased. Therefore, starting in July 1940, Panzer IV Model E tanks received reinforced armor protection. Instead of a 20mm screen, the hull front now had a solid 50mm plate, and the armor protection of the turret front was reinforced to the same thickness. As a result, the combat weight reached 48,501.64 pounds, which approached the tank's chassis load limit without modifications. Theoretically, thanks to the spaced armor, the tank had protection against guns with calibers of 37 to 45 millimeters. While the armaments department considered how to strengthen tank armor protection, the troops began to take their own action. The French campaign was the first instance when the Germans began to widely attach spare track links to their tanks. The invention of this improvised method of protection was accidental. After the French campaign, attaching track links to the front part of the hull and the superstructure became widespread and spontaneous. Most likely during combat, someone accidentally achieved a positive result, after which the idea spread throughout the troops. The additional armor for Panzer III models E through F differed because the driver's vision port had a different design. Consequently, the superstructure screen was not flush against the front plate. This improvement had a certain logic. In early 1944, tests were conducted at the NIBT proving ground on a T-34 tank, whose frontal armor was protected by spare tracks. The tests showed that at medium ranges, from 1,640 feet to 1,969 feet, the tracks had almost no effect on strengthening the armor. However, at a range of 3,281 feet and beyond, the effective engagement distance was reduced by 656 feet. It is important to note that the firing was carried out with a 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun, while in 1940 calibers were much smaller. Naturally, track armor only offered partial protection, but it could be installed directly on the front lines. The downside of this additional armor was an increase in combat weight. The added armor and the replacement of the gun with a more powerful one increased the vehicle's combat weight by 4,409 pounds. For the Panzer III, the widespread process of adding additional armor began in December 1940. At the same time, early versions of the Panzer IV received partial frontal hull armor. In the case of the Panzer III, additional 30mm plates were added to the frontal hull plate, the turret ring superstructure, and the upper rear plate. The method of attaching this additional armor to the turret ring superstructure varied. For the Panzer III, models E through F, spaced armor was used, while for the Panzer III, models G through H, the armor plate was fitted tightly against the front of the turret ring superstructure. The cost for this increased armor protection was a rise in combat weight. The front plates alone added an extra 1,224 pounds, not including the mounts. This addition of armor happened concurrently with the rearmament of tanks to 50mm KWK-38L-42 guns. As a result, the combat weight increased from 43,000 pounds to 47,300 pounds, necessitating a redesign of the suspension. Tanks were fitted with reinforced torsion bars and shock absorbers, as well as tracks 400 millimeters wide. As firing tests showed, the armor screen mounts could withstand 5 to 7 hits, even when struck by shells of 40 to 45 millimeters caliber. After that, the bolted connections would fail. Theoretically, the frontal hull armor protection, totaling 60 millimeters, should have protected against 40 to 45 millimeter caliber guns. In reality, this was not entirely true. As has been stated repeatedly, monolithic armor is always superior to spaced or additional armor, a fact further confirmed during firing tests conducted at the NIBT proving ground in October 1942. On the fourth hit, the nuts securing the armor screen were torn off, causing the screen to fall to the ground. This particular screen had sustained 2 hits from a 2-pounder gun, plus 2 hits from a 45mm anti-tank gun. In short, the additional screen did not last long. Of course, there were certain advantages to having additional armor, especially in North Africa, where by the summer of 1941, the British had anti-tank guns of 40mm caliber. The other point is that from the perspective of armor protection, this was more equivalent to 1940 standards. The armor screens for the turret ring superstructure, assembled from multiple pieces, proved to be an imperfect solution. Often just a couple of hits were enough to destroy them. An interesting point is that in both the case of the Panzer III and the Panzer IV, The reinforcement focused on increasing the hull's armor protection, but not the turrets. However, the front of the turret is one of the priority targets for tank and towed artillery. It is quite logical that the turret should also be reinforced, including with additional armor. This is precisely what the British did on the cruiser tank Mark IV, and what Soviet designers did when developing armor screens for the T-34 and KV-1, but not the Germans. While the Panzer IV's turret front was eventually reinforced on the later Panzer III models G and H, it remained 30 millimeters thick. The frontal thickness was only increased to 50 millimeters starting with the Panzer III Model J. Despite these changes, there was no additional armor for the turret itself. The only known example of this was the Vorpanzer, which was spaced armor fitted to the Panzer IV models D, E, and F. These screens, characterized by their massive design, were few in number. Furthermore, at an official level, adding armor to the turret was prohibited. The Vorpanzer was one of the very few instances where additional armor was used to strengthen the turret front. Due to the already heavy load on the frontal area, such a solution was generally viewed unfavorably. The reasons for this strange situation should be sought in the overall stress on the chassis of the Panzer III and Panzer IV. As previously mentioned, the additional armor kit for the Panzer III weighed over half a ton, and this weight was concentrated on the front road wheels. Adding spaced armor to the turret front would have added another 440 to 551 pounds, which also would have burdened the front road wheels. Considering that these road wheels already required strengthening, a further, uneven increase in load offered no beneficial outcome. Combat operations against the Soviet Union, which began on June 22, 1941, came as an extremely unpleasant surprise for German tank crews. While losses were not significant in June 1941, they grew substantially in July. The core of the Wehrmacht's tank fleet at that time consisted of vehicles produced in 1939 and 1940, most of which had undergone modernization, including the addition of armor plating. However, not all tanks had this additional armor, and the problem was partly addressed by hanging spare tracks on them. Nevertheless, by the summer of 1941, it became clear that the measures taken to reinforce armor protection were clearly insufficient. As practice showed, the Red Army employed the full spectrum of artillery against German tanks. Naturally, anti-tank artillery became the typical means of combating tanks, but battalion, divisional, and often corps artillery systems were also actively used. Incidentally, the same situation was observed on the German side. Under these conditions, it became clear that neither strengthening frontal armor protection to 1.96 inches nor armor screens solved the problem. At that moment, the main adversaries of German tanks, as with Soviet tanks, were not enemy tanks, but artillery. Nevertheless, by the autumn of 1941, German generals began to fully acknowledge both the KV-1 and the T-34, which were gradually becoming the primary types of Soviet tanks. Their installed 2.99-inch guns almost disregarded the armor of German tanks. As practice showed, the 1.96-inch armor, which the Panzer III Model J and Panzer IV Model F received, was insufficient to protect against 2.99-inch caliber guns. Naturally, this situation was unsatisfactory for German tank crews. For this reason, by the summer of 1941, tanks began to be massively outfitted with spare tracks. The most typical solution was to attach a strip of tracks to the front hull plate. The most resourceful crews also covered the front of the turret's support structure, with no one considering how much the combat weight increased as a result. The Germans began considering further reinforcement of armor protection as early as the summer of 1941, and this was not related to the start of Operation Barbarossa. The threat was anticipated in North Africa, where the British were expected to introduce more powerful anti-tank guns. The idea of a new wave of additional armor plating was first discussed on July 7, 1941. This time, Hitler was the initiator, proposing the use of spaced armor to strengthen the armor protection of the Panzer III Model J. Its purpose was that the screen would be attached at a distance of 3.93 inches from the main armor plate. Such a solution allowed for a thinner screen, 0.78 inches thick. As a result, the screen weighed 242.50 pounds compared to 341.71 pounds for a screen 1.18 inches thick. As before, it was attached with bolts. The chassis capacity was sufficient to install spaced armor on the front of the turret's support structure and the turret itself. The hull front remained 0.78 inches thick. Work on new armor screens was delayed, and experience from tank deployment on the Soviet-German front also emerged. Practice showed that the most common adversaries were tank and divisional guns with a 3 inches caliber, which had the ballistics of the USV divisional cannon. The USV armor-piercing shell could penetrate a plate 2 3/4 inches to 2 7/8 inches thick. Therefore, spaced armor adequately solved the protection problem. However, spaced armor only went into production by late spring of 1942. It covered the frontal section of the hull superstructure as well as the frontal section of the turret. In total, this screening weighed 551 to 661 pounds. This was clearly less than the screens for earlier tanks, but with one nuance. The hull's front plate did not receive screens and remained 1 97/100 inches thick. This was connected to the ongoing increase in combat weight. The Panzer III, Model J, had a combat weight of 23 81/100 tons, and with the screens, it approached 24 1/4 tons. More than half a U.S. ton was added due to the introduction of the 1 97/100 inches KWK-39 L60 cannon. This came close to the chassis' maximum load capacity, not to mention that an additional 1,984 pounds were concentrated on the tank's front. Very similar processes occurred with the Panzer IV, though the scenario was somewhat different. Firstly, the additional armor thickness was not 79/100 of an inch, but 1 18/100 inches. Secondly, there was no mention of spaced armor. The screens were either welded or bolted directly to the main armor. Thirdly, the protection scheme was different. Additional armor plates covered the front of the hull superstructure as well as the front plate of the hull. There was no longer enough weight allowance for the turret's front. This was because the first sets of additional armor began to be installed in May 1942 when Panzer IVs with long-barreled cannons entered production. As a result, the combat weight increased from 24 58/100 tons to 26 100 tons. Later, on the Panzer IV Model H version, screens were replaced with monolithic plates 3 15/100 inches thick. And at this point, the capabilities of the Panzer IV chassis were exhausted. In the case of the Panzer IV, the hull's front plate and the hull superstructure underwent reinforcement. However, there were no longer enough chassis resources to reinforce the turret's front. There was also a third vehicle that received armor screening in 1942. This refers to the Stugge 3 self-propelled artillery units. Similar to the Panzer IV, this vehicle had the capability to mount more powerful 2 95/100 inches caliber cannons, and at the same time, more potent armor protection. By September 1942, the front plate of the Stugge 40, Model F, which was how this vehicle became known after being re-equipped with the more powerful 7.5 centimeter Stu-K 40 cannon, as well as the frontal plate of the casemate, received welded screens 1 18/100 inches thick. As a result, the frontal armor thickness increased to 3 15/100 inches. The most mass-produced version of the self-propelled gun, the Stugge 40, Model G, also had screens. Notably, instead of welding the screens, they were attached with bolts. Later, closer to the autumn of 1943, the hull's front plate was made monolithic, meaning it was 3 15/100 inches thick. But the casemate screen in the area of the driver's position remained until the end of production. Also, concrete coating was often applied to the front sloped plates of the casemate, which served as additional protection. The Soviet perspective on the screening of German tanks and second-wave self-propelled artillery units is notable. A report from 1943 indicated that the spaced armor on the front of the Panzer III provided protection against armor-piercing and high-explosive anti-tank shells of 3 inches caliber. Similar conclusions were drawn regarding the Stugge 40 screens. However, this protection was not as reliable as it might have seemed. Upon impact from 2 95/100 to 3 inches caliber shells and larger, the screens were quickly destroyed, along with their attachments to the armor. 2 or 3 hits were often enough to completely destroy such a screen. In the realities of the second half of 1942 and beyond, when the T-34 became the primary Soviet tank, and American tanks with 75mm guns were used in North Africa, screens served more as an additional chance to withstand enemy fire. At the same time, tanks gradually lost mobility due to increasing combat weight, and the load on the chassis also grew. These two factors were among the reasons why the T-34's screens were abandoned at the end of February 1942. The Germans, however, followed their own path, which led to both positive and sharply negative results. As tests in September 1943 showed, screens did not always protect, even against a 45mm gun. Armor that was 30 plus 50 millimeters thick was penetrated by a sub-caliber shell. The practical effectiveness of screens was clearly demonstrated by test results conducted in September 1943 at the NIBT Proving Ground. A Stug 40 AOSFG self-propelled gun arrived there, featuring screens on the front of its hull and superstructure. The first step was to fire at the front of the hull with a 45mm tank gun. Naturally, an armor-piercing shell did not penetrate the armor that was 30 plus 50 millimeters thick, but a sub-caliber shell did. Although the distance was minimal at 492 feet, the test still revealed the error in the conclusions of the screen analysis report, which had stated that sub-caliber shells could not penetrate screens. Equally interesting was the result of firing at the front hull screen with a 57mm British tank gun. At a distance of 984 feet, the screen was penetrated, but the main armor only received a dent 7 to 8 millimeters deep. A second hit caused a piece of the screen to break off, and also tore off 6 bolts that fastened it. Firing with larger shells was not conducted, but everything suggests that the screen would have withstood 3 to 5 hits from 75 to 76mm shells. As observed, the increase in armor protection for German tanks primarily involved thickening the front of the hull and turret. This process was also seen in other countries. Differentiated armor became a worldwide practice, and this trend only intensified after the end of the Second World War. However, the Germans, and in some cases other tank-building nations, partly missed the moment when infantry anti-tank weaponry significantly strengthened, primarily concerning anti-tank rifles. By the start of the Second World War, the Germans believed that 30 millimeters of armor was sufficient for reliable side protection. This was indeed enough to withstand rifle-caliber armor-piercing bullets and shells from light automatic cannons. However, the level of infantry saturation with anti-tank weapons turned out to be much higher than expected, making tank losses from flank fire a frequent occurrence. The rapid pace of the French and Polish campaigns did not allow for a deep analysis of the situation, and the first months of the Great Patriotic War did not provide a complete picture of what was happening. From May 1943, screens also began to be installed on earlier versions of the tank. For example, in this case, the Panzer III AOSFG. This image clearly shows the drawback of using screens. To the sides, only the tank commander had a view. The situation began to change by early 1942 as the Red Army started receiving PTRD and PTRS anti-tank rifles in large numbers. For these rifles, 30mm armor was not a problem. The PTRD and PTRS could not penetrate German medium tanks from the front. However, it is important to avoid the illusion of an ideal battle where tanks are only targeted from the front. Anti-tank rifles were much more mobile than anti-tank artillery. Therefore, a situation where tanks faced massive flanking fire was quite typical. This was true not only for German tanks. A report on the damage inflicted on T-34 tanks during the spring and summer battles of 1942, prepared by Research Institute 48, stated that hits to the sides accounted for just over 50% of all damage. Even considering the poor visibility from Soviet medium and heavy tanks, this was a very high number. Incidentally, at this very time, visibility from German tanks began to decrease, due in no small part to the use of anti-tank rifles. Observation hatches on the sides of the hull and turret proved vulnerable to anti-tank rifle fire, so they were removed from the turret sides. Of course, this slightly improved resistance, but it increased the chance of the tank being under flanking fire. The range of approximately 984 feet to 1,640 feet, where Soviet rifles could penetrate the side armor of medium tanks, was considered their effective combat range. The peak production of Soviet anti-tank rifles occurred in 1942, and such a massive deployment to the Red Army could not go unanswered. Even if they did not penetrate the armor, they caused serious damage to the tank's running gear, often disabling it. By early 1943, there was an urgent need to create protection against anti-tank rifles. For the Panzer III and Panzer IV, protective screens were developed, which were quite similar in design. To protect the hull sides, a rather complex structure was created, which attached to the sides and the ends of the fenders. On these, 5mm thick screens were mounted in separate sections. Additionally, a 10mm thick screen was attached to the turret, which had small doors for accessing the side hatches. Furthermore, side screens were also developed for the Stu-40 Schürzen. On February 20, 1943, tests were conducted which showed that a PTRD rifle could penetrate the screen at a range of approximately 328 feet, but only left a dent on the armor underneath. Following these tests, an order was issued to implement these screens on tanks and Stu-40 vehicles being produced. Installation began in April 1943, and production of these screens was also set up for previously manufactured Panzer III, Panzer IV, and Stu vehicles. The kits reached the troops in May 1943, and they were first used on a large scale at the Battle of Kursk. Firing tests in September 1943 showed that the screens were effective against anti-tank rifle bullets, high-explosive fragmentation shells, and shape-charge anti-tank munitions. Naturally, this new development did not escape the attention of the main armored directorate of the Red Army. By September 1943, a Stu-40 Ausf-G and a Panzer III Ausf-N, both equipped with side screens, arrived at the NIBT proving ground. Firing tests were conducted, not even with a PTRD rifle, but with a 20mm RES anti-tank rifle. It was found that the penetration distance decreased to approximately 328 feet. Additionally, firing tests were conducted with a 14.5mm Blum anti-tank rifle. With the screens in place, it could not penetrate the side. A completely different picture emerged when firing larger calibers. For an armor-piercing shell from a 45mm tank cannon, the screens were no problem at all. The side of a Stu-40, protected by a 5mm screen, was penetrated at a range of approximately 2,953 feet. For a 45mm sub-caliber shell, the penetration range decreased to approximately 1,969 feet. For an armor-piercing shell from a 6-pound tank cannon, even approximately 2,953 feet was not the maximum penetration range. It did not even notice the screens. Exactly the same was observed with armor-piercing shells from the 75mm American M3 tank cannon, and with armor-piercing shells from the 76mm Soviet F-34 tank cannon. At most, the screens could slightly reduce the penetration range, especially in the case of sub-caliber shells. A more interesting side effect of the screens emerged, one that their creators initially did not suspect. Tests in the Soviet Union revealed that the screens were an excellent defense against high-explosive and shape-charged shells. These shells would hit the screen, creating a breach, but the main side armor would only suffer minor damage. By the end of 1943, many removed the side screens from the hull because they interfered with movement in rough terrain. Like many new technical solutions, side screens were initially planned for implementation on the maximum number of tanks and self-propelled guns. However, by late 1943, a trend emerged where screens were either not installed at all or were only partially installed. There were strong reasons for this. First, the screens added extra load to the chassis. For example, after all additions, the combat weight of the Panzer IV Model H grew to 55,116 pounds. Although this time the load was distributed evenly, it did not significantly ease the burden on the running gear. Second, already decreasing visibility became poor. In fact, only the tank commander could now look to the sides. Third, the screens tended to snag on the ground, trees, and other obstacles, then tear off, so they were often removed. Mesh screens were roughly equal in effectiveness to solid screens, but weighed considerably less. Naturally, the screens were constantly refined. In the autumn of 1943, improved screens appeared, differing not only in their fastenings, but also in being installed at an angle. Finally, in the autumn of 1944, mesh screens were introduced. It was found that they performed just as well as solid screens, but had a significantly lower weight. Nevertheless, the problems could not be entirely eliminated, so units often developed their own, smaller side screens. Experiments were also conducted with the method of attaching the screens, for example, at an angle. In this context, it is interesting to consider what happened with German tanks after the war. They were used in various countries for many years, but the screens were removed quite quickly, and the idea itself was met with considerable skepticism. In the Soviet Union, German-style side screens did not go beyond experiments. Effectively, the British were the only ones to adopt the screens. Considering that the British had been working on screens for quite some time, this is not surprising. However, the screens installed on the Centurion differed significantly in design. They were considerably smaller and lighter than the German ones, and their construction was simpler. In conclusion, it is worth discussing another method of additional tank protection, characteristic of the Germans. This refers to Zimmerit, a special paste that began to be widely applied to German tanks starting in the autumn of 1943. Discussions about why this was necessary continue to this day, especially since some countries that studied Zimmerit have their own theories. This also applied to the Soviet Union. In March 1943, the 6th Department of the Armaments Ministry initiated work to create a special paste that was to be applied to tanks and self-propelled artillery units. The competition had two requirements: fire resistance and good covering ability. Regarding what the paste was specifically created to counter, opinions vary. Various arguments are presented, including improved resistance against shells. However, even in the 1947 report from the Ministry of Transport Machine Building Commission, the objectives were clearly stated: protection against magnetic grenades and mines. The subtlety of the matter is that such devices were only used by the Germans themselves, meaning the development was preventative in nature. A number of companies participated in the competition, but the development by Chemische Werke Zimmer and Company from Berlin won. This company had extensive experience developing similar coatings for industrial facilities. The developed material, known as Zimmerit, consisted of 5 main components, including barium sulfate, zinc sulfate, and sawdust. The result was a paste that was easily applied to surfaces with a spatula. It was intended to be applied to vertical surfaces, which significantly reduced the effectiveness of magnetic mine attachment. It should be noted that complete prevention of magnetic attachment was not achieved, but the goal of making the enemy's task more difficult was accomplished. However, even in factories, Zimmerit was often applied to the wrong surfaces, for example to side skirts, which only made them heavier. According to the initial plan, Zimmerit was to be sent to the troops, where it would be applied. Similarly, screens were sent to the troops, where field workshops would install them. But screens were one thing, and a coating for tanks was another. The results of Zimmerit tests in the 7th and 4th Panzer Divisions conducted in the summer of 1943 were not very successful. Practice showed that Zimmerit was applied haphazardly, resulting in too much in some places and too little in others. Additionally, it was often applied to areas where it was simply not needed. Here, Zimmerit was even applied to the roof of the turret ring. It is difficult to imagine an enemy soldier climbing there with a magnetic mine. Based on the test results, it was decided to apply Zimmerit directly at the factories. In September and October of 1943, Zimmerit began to be applied to all medium and heavy tanks produced, as well as to Sturmgeschütz assault guns. At that time, a technology for applying Zimmerit was developed. First, a thin initial layer was applied to the surface and divided into squares with a spatula. 24 hours later, a second main layer was applied, featuring a distinctive texture. The wavy surface further reduced the possibility of mines being attached. In theory, the instructions for factories were identical, and Zimmerit application should have been uniform. However, in reality, the situation was different. The Zimmerit pattern differed slightly among manufacturers, and sometimes the differences were quite significant. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that barrels of Zimmerit still reached the troops. Further developments depended directly on the unit commander and even individual subunits. It got to the point where Zimmerit was applied to combat vehicles for which it made no sense at all, including half-track armored personnel carriers. Additionally, the practice of applying Zimmerit to surfaces where it was not needed continued. The Soviet side noticed the appearance of Zimmerit on German tanks in late 1943. In March 1944, Zimmerit samples were studied by specialists from the Scientific Research Institute for Film Production. During the study, the composition of the coating was correctly determined, but due to its high melting point of 2012 degrees Fahrenheit, the conclusions were not entirely accurate. According to Soviet specialists, the purpose of applying Zimmerit was to protect tanks from flammable liquids. A similar conclusion was reached by the main Armored Directorate, despite the fact that captured German tank crews clearly stated the purpose of Zimmerit during interrogations. As mentioned earlier, the Red Army did not have magnetic mines, so the main Armored Directorate of the Red Army did not fully understand the true reason for Zimmerit's use. The Germans stopped applying Zimmerit in September 1944. The reasons were practical. Magnetic mines were never used against German tanks and self-propelled guns. Moreover, enemy infantry had much more effective ways to combat tanks. As for the use of Zimmerit analogues by other participants in World War II, the British went the furthest in this matter, though it did not progress beyond field improvisations and experimental work.